The thunder of war wagons shakes the earth, while fervent chants rise from a radical army. This is not just a battle scene from the Hussite wars, it is the birth cry of the Taborites. By the end of this story, you will understand how a spiritual rebellion forged one of history's most effective and radical warrior brotherhoods. We will uncover why these fighters believed they were building a new Jerusalem, and what secret knowledge may have fueled their crusade. What does it truly mean to wage a war for the soul? Bohemia in the early 15th century was a land simmering with discontent, a pressure cooker of spiritual yearning and national pride. At the heart of this unrest was a profound conflict over the soul of Christianity itself. The Catholic Church, a monolithic power across Europe, was seen by many as having lost its way. From the highest offices in Rome to local parishes, stories of corruption, greed, and the selling of spiritual favors for money were rampant. This was not just a minor grievance. It was a deep, festering wound for a population that craved authentic faith. Into this volatile atmosphere stepped a man named Jan Hus, a preacher and scholar at the University of Prague. Hus was a fiery voice for reform, arguing that the Bible, not the Pope, should be the ultimate authority for Christians. He denounced the Church's wealth and corruption in plain language that resonated deeply with ordinary people, from nobles to peasants. His sermons, delivered not in scholarly Latin but in the common Czech tongue, became a rallying cry. They fused religious reform with a growing sense of Czech national identity, creating a powerful and dangerous mixture. The church authorities saw Hus as a direct threat. They summoned him to a great council in the city of Constance, promising him safe passage to discuss his ideas. It was a trap. Despite the emperor's guarantee of protection, Hus was arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned to death. In July of 1415, he was burned at the stake. His ashes were scattered into a river to prevent any relics from remaining, but you cannot kill an idea with fire. The martyrdom of Jan Hus did not extinguish his message. It turned his voice into an echo that reverberated across every hill and valley in Bohemia. The man was gone, but his cause was now immortal, transforming a religious dispute into a national crusade. The people of Bohemia felt betrayed by both the church and the empire, solidifying a resolve that would soon erupt into open rebellion. This was the powder keg, and the spark had just been lit. From the ashes of Hus's pyre, a new kind of community began to form in the Bohemian wilderness. Disillusioned peasants, artisans, and lesser nobles, all united by their radical faith, started to gather on a high hill overlooking the Luzhnus River. They did not see this place as just another town. They named it Tabor, after the mountain in the Holy Land where, according to Scripture, Christ was transfigured. This was a declaration of intent. They believed they were building the new Jerusalem, a city on a hill that would be a beacon of pure faith and the launching point for God's final judgment. Their belief was rooted in a powerful millenarian fervor. They were utterly convinced that the end of the world was at hand, that the current age of corruption was about to be swept away by Christ's return. This was not a distant theological concept. It was a visceral, urgent reality that shaped every aspect of life in their new home. The old world of kings and popes was dying, and they were the vanguard of the new one. Think of the sheer, electrifying energy of that belief. Every decision, from building a wall to baking bread, was infused with cosmic significance. They were not merely constructing a fortress, they were preparing the stage for the culmination of human history. This spiritual certainty forged a community of incredible resilience and radical equality. In the early days of Tabor, all private property was abolished. Money was thrown into a common chest in the public square, and resources were shared among all believers. They addressed each other as brother and sister, rejecting the rigid feudal hierarchies of the world they had left behind. The very landscape reflected their ideology. The city was designed as a circular fortress, a physical manifestation of their unity and defense against the corrupt outer darkness. Every stone laid was both a practical measure for survival and a spiritual act of defiance. They were creating a utopia under siege, a society so pure and so militant that it believed it could hasten the kingdom of heaven itself. This radical New Jerusalem demanded a faith just as pure and uncompromising, while other followers of Jan Hus sought reform from within the church structure. The Taborites believed the entire edifice was rotten beyond saving. Their theology was not a gentle revision, it was a spiritual revolution that aimed to strip Christianity back to its bare bones. They looked at the vast, ornate hierarchy of cardinals and bishops and saw not shepherds, but a barrier between humanity and God. In their eyes, the true church was not a physical building or an institution. It was the invisible community of the faithful, the elect who were ready for Christ's return. This led them to a stunning conclusion. They rejected the entire concept of a separate, ordained priesthood. They championed the idea of the priesthood of all believers. What did this mean in practice? It meant that any righteous man, be he a farmer, a blacksmith, or a cobbler, could stand before the community and preach the word of God. The Spirit, not a ceremony conducted by a corrupt church, was what gave a person the authority to lead. This leveling principle extended to the sacraments, the very rituals that defined medieval Christian life. The Taborites performed a ruthless triage on church doctrine. They declared that most of the 7 sacraments were later inventions, human traditions that had no basis in the original scripture. One by one, they cast them aside. Baptism for infants unnecessary, confirmation gone, confession to a priest, a pointless intermediary, the last rites. A superstition, they even rejected the sanctity of marriage as a formal sacrament. In the end, they kept only one communion, but even here, they pushed further than their more moderate Hussite cousins, the Utraquists. The Utraquists fought for the right of all laypeople to receive both the bread and the wine during the Mass, a practice known as Utraquism. The Taborites agreed, but their belief was more profound. For them, communion was not just a ritual, it was a direct communal meal with Christ, free from the magical incantations of a priest. All of this was guided by a single, unshakable principle, the literal word of the Bible. They believed Scripture was a clear blueprint for how to live, not a text to be interpreted and softened by centuries of church tradition. And when they read the accounts of Christ's apostles, they saw a model of radical poverty. The apostles owned nothing, shared everything, and lived in holy simplicity. The Taborites took this as a direct command. They argued that true faith was impossible amid wealth and property. To follow Christ was to embrace a life of apostolic poverty, to renounce the material world that the official church so blatantly coveted. This was not an abstract ideal, it was a strict rule that governed their early community. Their literal reading of Scripture did not just shape their morals, it shaped their destiny. It convinced them that the final battle between good and evil was not a metaphor, but a physical war they were destined to fight. Their faith was a forge, hammering them into a community that saw itself as God's own army, tasked with cleansing the earth with fire and sword before the Messiah's arrival. This conviction that the end was near transformed their reality into a landscape of divine drama. For the Taborites, prophecies were not distant predictions, but a daily news feed from heaven, describing events already in motion. They meticulously scoured the books of Daniel and Revelation, finding in their cryptic verses a clear and present roadmap. The corrupt church was the whore of Babylon. The Holy Roman Emperor was the beast, and they, the purified community on the hill, were the chosen saints destined to wield the sword of God's wrath. This was not a quiet, patient waiting for salvation. It was an active, urgent mission to clear the path for Christ's return by violently purging the world of evil. Their millenarian faith became the ultimate justification for everything they did. Why obey the laws of a king when that king served the Antichrist? Why respect the property of a wealthy lord when all material possessions were about to be consumed in holy fire? Their radical social experiment, the abolition of private property and the rejection of feudal titles, was not just a political statement. It was a necessary act of purification, a way of living as if the kingdom of heaven had already begun. They were rehearsing for eternity. This end-times fervor reached its peak in their belief in the 5 cities of refuge. As imperial armies began to mobilize against the Hussite heresy, preachers proclaimed a divine warning. God would soon pour out his wrath upon the sinful, but he would spare the faithful who fled to 5 specific cities in the Bohemian countryside. Tabor was the most famous, but others like Pisic and Slaney became similar bastions. Can you envision the scenes on the roads? Thousands of men, women, and children, leaving their homes with only what they could carry, driven by a terrifying and exhilarating hope. They were not merely running from soldiers, they were fleeing the condemnation of a world they believed was in its final days. This mass migration was both a spiritual exodus and a brilliant military strategy, concentrating their most fervent supporters into easily defensible, ideologically unified fortresses. The most extreme among them believed they would not even need to fight the final battles themselves. They preached that angels would descend from the clouds, that the very stones would rise up to defend the righteous. This absolute certainty in divine intervention forged a courage that bordered on recklessness, making Taborite warriors a terrifying foe on the battlefield. How could you intimidate an army that truly believes it is immortal, that death is merely a quick passage into paradise? Their apocalyptic vision was the engine of their revolution, a force that justified a total war against the world as it was, all for a vision of the world as they were sure it was about to become. This radical faith did not just build a new society, it demanded the violent destruction of the old one. How could a movement so focused on Christ's teachings of peace reconcile itself with the sword? For the Taborites, there was no contradiction. They saw themselves not as aggressors, but as divine instruments, the chosen warriors tasked with executing God's final judgment. Their violence was not a necessary evil, it was a sacred duty. They looked to the Old Testament not as ancient history, but as a direct playbook for their own time. The battles of Joshua against the Canaanites, the Psalms calling for the shattering of enemies, these were not allegories. They were blueprints for a holy war that was happening again, right here in Bohemia. They believed they were the new Israel, and the Catholic Church and its allies were the new Amalekites, a sinful people destined for utter annihilation. Every knight and mercenary marching against them was not just a political enemy, but a literal servant of the Antichrist, a block of sin preventing the dawn of the Messianic age. To kill such a person was not murder, it was an act of purification, a way of clearing the land of spiritual pollution. Their most famous battle cry made this terrifyingly clear. As they marched, they would chant, "You are all the enemies of God, and we must fight you." This was not a threat, it was a statement of theological fact. In their eyes, they were merely the physical hands of God's own wrath, swinging the flail that he himself had provided. This spiritual justification transformed ordinary peasants into an army of unshakable conviction. A man facing a charging knight on horseback was not just a farmer with a pike. He was a warrior priest standing between the kingdom of darkness and the kingdom of light. His courage was fueled by the absolute belief that every enemy he struck down was a blow struck for heaven itself. This was not a war for land or titles. It was a cosmic cleanup operation, a necessary and bloody prelude to eternal peace. This unshakable faith required a new kind of army, one that could withstand the charge of Europe's finest knights. Their answer was not found in a miracle, but in a brilliant adaptation of the common farm wagon. The Taborites transformed this everyday vehicle into their ultimate strategic weapon, the War Wagon Fortress. Picture a heavy, reinforced cart, its sides built up with thick wooden planks, strong enough to stop an arrow or even a crossbow bolt. A team of horses could move it quickly across the Bohemian plains, but in battle, its wheels were chained together, creating an instant mobile wall. This was not a single cart, but a whole circle or square of them, lashed together with chains to form an impenetrable corral on the battlefield. Inside this moving fortress, the Taborite army was protected, a hive of deadly activity. Each wagon was a self-contained combat unit, crewed by a team of men who knew their roles perfectly. There were soldiers armed with long, hooked pikes to pull knights from their saddles. Others wielded the infamous peasant flail, a brutal agricultural tool adapted for war. Its long, swinging chain could crush armor and bone with terrifying force, a weapon that required immense skill but was devastating in the hands of a farmer who had used one his whole life. But the true genius of the war wagon was how it integrated new technology. From firing slits carved into the wooden walls, handgunners would take aim. These were early firearms, unpredictable and slow to reload, but from the safety of the wagon wall, their fire could shatter the cohesion of a charging line. Most revolutionary of all were the light cannons, some small enough for 1 or 2 men to handle, mounted directly on the wagons. Imagine the shock of an armored knight, trained for a lifetime in traditional combat, facing a moving fortress that spat fire and iron. The typical feudal charge, the pinnacle of medieval warfare, became useless. Horses would not crash into the spiked wagon wall, and knights dismounting to attack on foot found themselves bogged down, exposed to a storm of shot, flails, and pikes from above. The Taborites turned the battlefield into a killing zone of their own design. They did not meet the enemy on the enemy's terms. They forced the enemy to fight on theirs, from within a fortress they could build anywhere in minutes. This was a military revolution born from necessity, a perfect fusion of peasant ingenuity, radical faith, and the emerging power of gunpowder, creating a force that would defy empires. At the heart of this war wagon revolution was a commander whose name would become a legend, Jan Žižka. He was not a nobleman groomed for command, but a seasoned mercenary who had learned his trade fighting across Central Europe. He understood the strengths and fatal weaknesses of traditional knightly armies, and he possessed a genius for turning peasant recruits into a disciplined, unstoppable force. Zizka was the architect of the war wagon tactics, perfecting their use not in a training yard but in the furnace of battle. He trained his men to form their wagon forts with incredible speed, to move as a single, coordinated unit, and to unleash a devastating counterattack the moment the enemy's charge broke against their walls. His true brilliance, however, lay in his ability to adapt. He was a master of using the terrain, luring enemy knights into swamps or narrow passes where their greatest asset, the heavy cavalry charge, became a fatal liability. He turned the Bohemian landscape itself into his ally, but the most astonishing part of his story was his absolute refusal to yield. During one siege, an arrow struck him in his one good eye, leaving him completely blind. For any other general, this would have been the end of a military career. For Zizka, it was merely an inconvenience. He continued to command his armies, dictating orders and strategies from a litter carried among his troops. He could not see the battlefield with his eyes, but he could see it with his mind, visualizing the positions of his wagons and the movements of the enemy through reports from his trusted officers. His blindness only deepened the mythic aura surrounding him. To his Taborite followers, he was not a disabled old man. He was an instrument of divine will, a prophet who saw with a spiritual vision they could only dream of. His very presence on the battlefield, blind and unyielding, was a living sermon on their core belief that faith and will could overcome any worldly obstacle. He became the physical embodiment of their defiance, a symbol that they could, and would, fight the whole world if they had to. Even after his death from the plague in 1424, his legend continued to lead them. In a final, chilling testament to his importance, he ordered that his skin be stretched across a drum so that he could still lead his people into battle. The drum was never made, but the story itself captures the terrifying spirit of the man and the movement he led. a force so determined that even death could not fully silence its general. Yet even this revolutionary military genius could not shield the Taborites from the deeper currents of belief flowing beneath the surface of medieval Europe. Where did such radical ideas truly come from? The sudden emergence of their uncompromising dualism, their absolute rejection of a corrupt material world, feels too systematic to have sprung from the soil of Bohemia alone. Many historians see the ghost of an older, far more widespread heresy whispering through their doctrines. A century before, in the sun-drenched lands of southern France, the Cathars had built a faith on a similar, stark division between spirit and matter. They saw the physical world not as God's creation, but as the prison of a lesser, evil deity. While the Taborites were not full Cathar dualists, the echoes are haunting. Both movements viewed the established church as the whore of Babylon, an irredeemable institution of pure evil. Both championed a life of apostolic poverty as the only path to purity. The Cathars had their perfecti, a spiritual elite who renounced all worldly things, a concept that resonates with the Taborites' own vision of themselves as a purified elect. So how could these ideas travel from the Pyrenees to the heart of Bohemia? The routes were there, hidden in plain sight. The trade roads that carried silk and spice also carried forbidden books and secret conversations. Bohemia was a crossroads, and its university in Prague was a magnet for scholars from across the continent, some of whom undoubtedly brought with them fragments of these suppressed teachings. It is not a direct lineage, but more like a spiritual seepage, where core ideas find new life in a different rebellion. Another powerful, shadowy influence was the movement of the Free Spirit. This was not a single church, but a scattered network of mystics and radicals who believed that by achieving utter poverty and self-surrender, a person could become so unified with God that they were beyond sin, beyond earthly law. Imagine the implication: if you are one with the divine, then no priest, no king, no sacrament has any authority over you. You are truly free. We hear clear echoes of this in the Taborite rejection of priesthood and their belief in a direct personal connection to God through the Spirit. This antinomianism, this idea that the saved are not bound by moral law, may have fueled their most extreme actions, providing a theological justification for the violent overthrow of the old order. After all, if you are cleansing the world for God, are you not acting as His direct hand? The tapestry of Taborite belief appears to be woven with many threads, some from the fiery sermons of Jan Hus, but others drawn from a much older, underground river of European mysticism and dissent. These hidden connections suggest they were not an isolated anomaly, but the most explosive and militant manifestation of a perennial undercurrent, a secret history of spirituality that forever challenges the powers of the world. This spiritual war against the old world was not confined to the battlefield. It was waged with equal ferocity inside the very churches the Taborites captured from their enemies. They saw the ornate cathedrals not as houses of God, but as gilded cages for the spirit, filled with idols that distracted from true worship. Their response was systematic and shocking. They stormed into these sacred spaces and began to smash everything in sight. Stained glass windows depicting saints were shattered into colored dust. Painted altar pieces were hacked to splinters. Stone statues of the Virgin Mary were toppled and their faces deliberately defaced to the outside world. This was pure vandalism, the work of a frenzied mob. But for the Taborites, every swing of the hammer was a deliberate act of theological purity. They were not destroying art, they were destroying a lie. Their literal reading of the Bible, particularly the commandment against graven images, left no room for compromise. In their eyes, a painting of a saint was not a representation, it was a false god, a piece of wood or stone that ignorant people were mistakenly worshipping instead of the invisible, formless divine. This was the ultimate extension of their rejection of priestly mediation. Why pray to a statue of a saint when you could pray directly to God? Why focus on a beautiful painting of the crucifixion when you could read the actual account in Scripture? Every statue, every fresco, every jeweled relic was a barrier, a human invention that stood between the believer and a direct, unadorned encounter with the divine. They sought to strip faith down to its bare essence, to a raw and personal relationship with God that needed no beautiful props. Imagine the sensory shock of entering a Taborite church. The riot of color and gold was gone, replaced by plain whitewashed walls. The only sound was the human voice, reading from the Bible or singing a hymn in the common tongue. The air, once thick with incense, was clear. It was a spiritual cleansing, an attempt to create a vacuum where the Holy Spirit could enter directly, without the interference of human artistry. This was a spirituality of stark truth, where a symbol was seen not as a pointer to the sacred, but as a replacement for it. In their quest for absolute purity, they believed they were tearing down the veils to see God face to face. Their stark whitewashed churches were a mirror of the society they were trying to build. Inside the walls of Tabor, the spiritual revolution against images and priests was matched by a social revolution just as radical. They attempted to erase the very foundations of medieval life, creating a community that has led many to ask a startling question: were the Taborites the first communists? The answer is not simple, but their experiment was profound. In the early, feverish days of the settlement, the concept of private property was declared a sin. The old world's wealth, they believed, was tainted by the corruption of the church and the oppression of the nobility. To be pure, they had to be poor collectively. They established a common treasury in the main square, a large chest where new arrivals would throw their money, their jewels, any personal possessions of value. This was not a tax, it was a total renunciation. Resources were then redistributed according to need. A blacksmith received iron, a baker received flour, a family received shelter, all from the shared pool. The biblical model of the early Christians, who held all things in common, was their direct inspiration. They were not just reading those verses, they were living them. This economic leveling was inseparable from a social one. They abolished the intricate dance of feudal titles and honorifics. There were no lords or serfs within their holy city, only brothers and sisters. A low-born peasant who was a gifted speaker could lead a sermon, while a disaffected knight who joined their cause took his place as an equal soldier in the wagon fort. The entire pyramid of medieval society, with the king at the top and the peasant crushed at the bottom, was flattened into a single, united circle. So, does this make them communists? The term is a modern one, laden with meanings they would not recognize. They were not driven by a materialist analysis of class struggle, but by a fiery, apocalyptic Christianity. Their goal was not a workers' state, but the kingdom of God. Yet the structure they built, with its common ownership and classless ethos, is one of the most striking precedents for communist thought in European history. Similarly, their rejection of all external authority, be it from the emperor or the pope, and their belief in a self-governing community of the faithful, echoes the core principles of Christian anarchism. They believed God's law, as they read it in the Bible, was the only authority, making human kings and hierarchies obsolete. This radical social structure was the ultimate expression of their faith, a living declaration that the old world was dead and a new one was being born in their fortified hilltop city. It was a breathtaking, if ultimately temporary, vision of a society remade from the ground up, not for man but for God. But this radical social experiment had its own radical fringe, a splinter group so extreme that even the Taborites saw them as a dangerous heresy. They called themselves the Adamites, and they believed they had achieved something no other Christians had, a complete return to the state of innocence enjoyed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before the fall. Their logic was stark and to them flawless. If they were truly living in the kingdom of the Spirit, purified and free from sin, then they had transcended the laws and shame that came with the fall. This belief manifested in ways that shocked the rest of Bohemia. They practiced ritual nudism, casting off their clothes as symbolic of casting off the corruption of the old world. They saw the body not as something sinful, but as a pure creation of God, now restored to its original, blameless state. Their gatherings, often held at night in remote forests or islands in the Zizka River, were ecstatic affairs. By the light of bonfires, these men and women, believing themselves to be in a state of grace beyond good and evil, engaged in what their enemies called free love. For the Adamites, this was not licentiousness, it was a sacred ritual, a celebration of their regained innocence and a rejection of all man-made laws, including marriage. They saw themselves as the true church, the final, perfect evolution of the Hussite rebellion. Their leader, a charismatic figure known as the Prophet Adam, preached that they were literally incapable of sinning. Any action performed in their state of grace was, by definition, holy. This antinomian belief that they were above moral law made them utterly uncontrollable and a profound threat to the main Taborite movement. Jan Žižka, the blind general, was a man of iron discipline and fierce doctrinal purity. He tolerated no challenge to his military authority or the core tenets of the Taborite faith. The Adamites represented both. Their wild, anarchic behavior threatened the strict order of the War Wagon army, and their theological excesses risked discrediting the entire Hussite cause in the eyes of potential allies. In the winter of 1421, Zizka decided they had to be eliminated. He marched a contingent of his most loyal troops to the Adamite stronghold on an island in the Zizka River. The ensuing confrontation was not a battle between two opposing armies, but a brutal suppression. The Adamites, armed with little more than their fervent belief, were no match for Zizka's seasoned veterans. They were surrounded and crushed. The survivors were captured and brought back to Tabor for a grim spectacle of justice. There, in a field outside the city walls, dozens of Adamites were burned to death in a mass execution. The Taborites, themselves heretics in the eyes of Rome, had become executioners of heretics. This act reveals a crucial, often overlooked truth about revolutions. Even the most radical movements have their limits, their own orthodoxy that cannot be breached. The Adamites had taken the Taborite dream of a new world to its most logical, and for their contemporaries, most terrifying conclusion. In silencing them, Zizka was not just crushing a rival sect. He was drawing a stark line in the sand, defining how far the rebellion was willing to go in its war against the old world. Their conviction of being God's new chosen people was not just a spiritual idea. It was the very bedrock of their identity, forged in the fires of political and cultural struggle. This belief fused their radical faith with a powerful, emerging sense of Czech nationalism, creating a force that was both religious and profoundly patriotic. The Taborites saw their homeland of Bohemia not merely as a kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, but as a sacred landscape, a new holy land for a new Israel. They looked back to the martyrdom of Jan Hus and saw a parallel to the ancient prophets of Israel, men who were persecuted for speaking God's truth to a corrupt power. Just as the Israelites were led out of Egypt, the Czech people were being led out of the spiritual bondage of Rome. This narrative gave their rebellion an immense sense of cosmic purpose. They were not just fighting for religious reform or political rights. They were fulfilling a divine destiny laid out for them, and them alone, in the scriptures. The Czech language itself became a sacred instrument in this drama. While the Catholic Church conducted its Mass in Latin, a language mysterious and inaccessible to the common person, the Taborites preached, sang, and read the Bible in Czech. This was a revolutionary act. It declared that God understood the tongue of the plowman and the blacksmith, that divine revelation was not the sole property of a foreign, Italian-speaking elite. This linguistic pride cemented the bond between faith and nation. To be a true Christian was to be a Czech patriot, and to be a Czech patriot was to take up the sword against the German-speaking emperor and his allies. Their battle hymns, still sung in the Czech Republic today, are filled with this potent mixture. They call upon Czech saints and warriors of legend, they celebrate the beauty of the Czech landscape, and they proclaim God's special favor for the Czech people. Imagine the power of singing such a hymn on the eve of battle, surrounded by your countrymen within the safety of the war wagons. You are not just a soldier, you are a warrior for a nation anointed by God. This divine election also came with a heavy responsibility. As the new chosen people, they believed they had a sacred duty to purify the entire world, starting with their own land. Every victory on the battlefield was proof of God's favor, every setback a test of their faith. This complex of divine election and national destiny made them utterly uncompromising. How could you negotiate with the servants of the Antichrist? How could you make peace with an empire that God himself had condemned? This unshakable belief was the source of their incredible strength, but it also sowed the seeds for their eventual isolation, for a people chosen by God often find it difficult to walk beside those they see as merely ordinary. Their faith was a weapon sharper than any sword. Beyond the wooden walls of their war wagons, the Taborites waged a relentless battle for the minds of their enemies. Before the first cannon fired, they unleashed a storm of sound and symbol designed to shatter the morale of the knights arrayed against them. They marched into battle not in silence, but singing. Their hymns were not gentle prayers. They were war chants set to music, thunderous choruses that thousands of voices would belt out across the field. These songs declared they were the warriors of God, that their cause was holy, and that death in his service was a glorious reward. Imagine the psychological impact on a conscripted soldier, hearing that wall of sound rolling toward him, a clear message that his opponents did not fear him or even death itself. This auditory assault was paired with powerful visual symbols. Their banners were not embroidered with the heraldry of noble houses, but with stark religious images. One of their most famous was a giant golden chalice, the symbol of their right to communion for all believers. To the Catholic knights, this banner was not just a flag, it was a declaration of heresy made visible, a blasphemous standard that they were being ordered to attack. Other banners might depict a Hussite warrior communing directly with Christ, reinforcing their belief in a priesthood of all believers, or show the wrathful God of the Old Testament, a reminder of the divine judgment they believed they were enacting. The very sight of these banners transformed the battlefield from a political conflict into a spiritual showdown, but the true core of their psychological warfare was the preaching that happened just before combat. A commander, often a priest who was also a soldier, would stand before the ranks and deliver not a tactical briefing, but a fiery sermon. He would remind them that they were the army of the living God, that their enemies were the legions of the Antichrist, and that every blow they struck was an act of divine purification. He would assure them that if they fell, angels would immediately carry their souls to paradise. This was more than a pep talk. It was a theological recalibration that placed each soldier outside the normal human fears of pain and mortality. How do you defeat an army that genuinely believes it is immortal? How do you intimidate a foe who sees your charge not as a threat, but as an opportunity for martyrdom? This unshakable belief made them terrifyingly unpredictable. They would launch attacks that seemed suicidal to a conventional general, because in their calculus there was no such thing as suicide, only a faster path to heaven. They would hold positions against impossible odds, their resolve hardening as the situation grew more desperate, because desperation was just another sign that the final battle was at hand. Their morale was not based on the chance of victory, but on the certainty of their righteousness, a force that no imperial army could ever break. Perched high on a steep hill above the Luzhnus River, the city of Tabor was far more than a town. It was a statement carved into the very landscape. The approach to the city was a challenge in itself, a slow, arduous climb up slopes that broke the momentum of any attacking force. The natural defenses were formidable, with the river curling around its base like a moat and ravines protecting its flanks, but the Taborites did not rely on nature alone. They transformed their hilltop into a masterpiece of military engineering, surrounding the entire settlement with massive walls of stone and timber, punctuated by stout towers that gave their gunners a commanding field of fire. These were not the decorative walls of a noble's castle. They were purely functional, brutal, and efficient, designed by people who knew they would have to withstand the full might of an empire. The city's layout was a reflection of their ideology. Its circular design, radiating from a central square, was a physical echo of their communal unity. Every street was planned to facilitate defense, creating kill zones where invaders could be trapped and annihilated. The entire city was a fortress, but it was also a sanctuary. Deep beneath the streets, they carved out a labyrinth of cellars and tunnels, spaces where the community could shelter during bombardments and where supplies were stored to endure a long siege. This was a place built to outlast the world they were rejecting. For over a decade, this mountain fortress served as the unshakable heart of the rebellion. It was from here that their armies marched out, and it was to here they returned, their war wagons rumbling back through the gates, laden with supplies taken from their enemies. The city was their arsenal, their treasury, and their spiritual home. The sight of its banners flying defiantly from the walls was a constant reassurance to their followers and a chilling warning to their foes. A besieging army would have to contend not just with the walls and the defenders, but with the sheer psychological weight of the place. They were not just laying siege to a city, they were assaulting an idea, a symbol of a new world that refused to die. How do you conquer a people whose home is both a physical stronghold and the embodiment of their faith? As long as Tabor stood, the revolution lived. Yet even the strongest fortress can crumble from within. The very spiritual fire that forged the Taborites began to consume them, as a deep chasm opened between their radical ideals and the hard realities of a long war. On one side stood the priests, the guardians of ideological purity, who believed any compromise with the sinful world was a betrayal of God. They demanded constant crusades, the total rejection of all peace offers, and the relentless purification of their own ranks. Facing them were the military commanders, veterans like the successors of Jan Žižka, who understood the grim mathematics of survival. They saw a movement exhausted by years of fighting, its resources stretched thin, and its people yearning for a semblance of normal life. For these pragmatic leaders, a temporary truce or a tactical alliance was not heresy, it was simple necessity. The most devastating blow, however, came from heaven itself. The prophets had declared with absolute certainty that the world would end, that Christ would return to rule from Tabor. They had staked everything on this imminent apocalypse. But the years passed and the sun continued to rise and set. The final battle did not materialize, and the corrupt old world stubbornly refused to vanish. This created a profound crisis of faith. What happens to a revolution when its divine deadline passes without event? The electrifying certainty that had made their peasants into giants on the battlefield began to drain away, replaced by doubt and disillusionment. If the apocalypse was not coming, then what was all the fighting for? This theological shockwave fractured the community. The most fervent believers argued that the delay was a test from God, a reason to become even more radical and purge even more suspected sinners from their midst. Others, however, began to quietly question the entire foundation of their millenarian dream. They started to look at the more moderate Hussite factions, the Utraquists, who were negotiating for a peace that would allow them to practice their faith within the kingdom. The dream of a new Jerusalem was colliding with the mundane need for a stable harvest and a safe home for one's children. This internal struggle between the perfect world they had preached and the imperfect world they actually inhabited would ultimately prove more dangerous than any imperial army. The end came not with a divine thunderclap, but with a cruel trick of warfare. For years, the Taborite war wagons had been an unbreachable fortress on the move, but at the Battle of Lipany in 1434, their enemies finally learned how to turn that strength into a fatal trap. The forces arrayed against them were a grim testament to how isolated the radicals had become. The more moderate Hussites, known as the Utraquists, had grown weary of the endless war and the Taborites' refusal to accept any peace. They forged an alliance with the very Catholics they had once fought, united by a single goal to crush the radical dream for good. The Utraquist commanders knew the Taborite tactics intimately, for they had once fought side by side. They understood that a direct assault on the wagon fort was suicide, so they devised a plan of brilliant deception. Their army advanced on the Taborite position, then feigned a panicked, total retreat. They broke ranks and fled, seemingly in disarray, abandoning their own artillery on the field. To the veteran Taborite soldiers, this was the moment they had trained for, the enemy breaking against their walls. The order was given to launch a counterattack, to surge from the safety of the wagons and cut down the fleeing foe. It was precisely what the Utraquists had prayed they would do. As the Taborite soldiers poured out in pursuit, a hidden reserve of Utraquist cavalry, held back for this exact moment, thundered into the fray. They slammed into the disorganized Taborite ranks, while the soldiers who had been pretending to flee now turned and attacked. The Taborites were caught completely in the open, separated from their mobile fortress. The war wagons, their greatest weapon, became a useless wooden wall as the battle raged away from them. The fighting was swift and merciless. The Taborite army was surrounded and systematically annihilated. Their most experienced commanders were killed, and thousands of their best soldiers lay dead on the field. The defeat at Lipany was more than a lost battle. It was the extinguishing of a flame. The radical dream of building a new world by force of arms died on that field. The political and military power of the Taborites was shattered beyond recovery. Within a year, their leaders were forced to sign a formal agreement, subordinating themselves to the Utraquist cause and the Bohemian king. The city of Tabor itself was allowed to stand, but its walls now enclosed a community that had been forcibly brought back into the world it once vowed to destroy. The revolution was over. The world they had tried to burn down did not vanish, it simply closed in around them. After the slaughter at Lipany, the surviving Taborites were a people stripped of their army, their political voice, and their divine deadline. The revolution was forcibly dismantled. The radical priests who had preached holy war were silenced, their pulpits taken over by more moderate voices. The common treasury that had once symbolized their brotherhood was emptied, its ideal of shared property dissolving under the pressure to survive in a world that still ran on coins and trade. The city of Tabor remained on its hill, but it was no longer a beacon for the new Jerusalem. It became just another town in the kingdom of Bohemia, its famous walls now a historical curiosity rather than a defiant barrier against the world. Many of the former radicals, weary and disillusioned, quietly drifted back into the folds of the more acceptable Utraquist Church, which had secured a fragile peace with the Catholic Emperor. They kept the chalice, the symbol of communion for all, but they left behind the flail and the dream of a world purified by fire. Others, perhaps those whose faith had been most deeply scarred by the failed apocalypse, even returned fully to the Catholic Church, exchanging the fervor of rebellion for the comfort of familiar ritual and societal acceptance. It was a quiet, unspectacular end. The flame of their radical spirit did not so much get stamped out as it simply faded, like a candle burning down to its last bit of wax, its light absorbed by the very darkness it had sought to obliterate. Their city still stands today, a peaceful Czech town whose name whispers of its tumultuous past, a monument to a breathtaking dream that proved too radical for the world to bear. Yet the dream did not truly die at Lipany. It merely went underground, its radical spirit flowing like a hidden river through the centuries, surfacing in other rebellions that shook the foundations of Europe. The Taborites' cry for a world remade from the ground up found a powerful echo just over a century later, during the German Peasants' War. When the peasants of Swabia and Thuringia rose up in 1524, their demands were startlingly familiar. They called for the abolition of serfdom, for communities to choose their own pastors, and for the common people to have access to the resources of the land. Their manifesto, the 12 Articles, reads like a secularized version of the Taborite program, translated from divine mandate into human rights. While the connection is not a direct line, the ideas had traveled along the trade routes and through the writings of radical preachers, proving that the desire for a kingdom of God on earth, a kingdom of justice, was a seed that could lie dormant and then erupt with renewed force. This same river of dissent flowed into the most radical streams of the Protestant Reformation, particularly among the Anabaptists. In the city of Münster in 1534, Anabaptist radicals took control and established a new Zion that was a chilling mirror of early Tabor. They too abolished private property, creating a community of goods where everything was shared. They too believed they were living in the end times, and they too fused religious fervor with a militant defense of their holy city against besieging armies. The parallels are so strong they cannot be ignored, suggesting a shared underground tradition of apocalyptic hope and social revolution that transcended national borders. Even later, in the turbulent 17th century, the digging of the soil by the English diggers and the leveling impulses of the levelers during the English Civil War carried faint whispers of the Taborite vision. These groups argued for the common ownership of land and for a far more democratic and egalitarian society, challenging the very notion of a divinely ordained social hierarchy. They were all part of a perennial undercurrent, a secret history of those who read their Bibles and saw not a call for quiet obedience, but a blueprint for revolution. The Taborites were not a singular anomaly. They were a spectacular and early flash of a lightning bolt that would continue to illuminate, for centuries, the deep human yearning for a world where spiritual freedom and social justice were one and the same. The clatter of war wagons had long faded into silence, yet a different kind of army was just beginning to march. It moved not on the battlefield, but in the stories told by grandmothers beside the hearth, in the defiant verses of folk songs sung in village taverns, and in the quiet pride of a people refusing to forget. History had recorded the Taborites' military defeat, but folklore granted them a second immortal life. Jan Žižka, the blind general, was transformed from a man into a force of nature. In legend, his blindness was no longer a disability, but a source of supernatural power, a sign that he saw with the eyes of God himself. Tales spread that he commanded the very elements, that storms would arise to aid him in battle, and that the rocks of the Bohemian countryside would cry out to warn him of approaching enemies. He became a Czech King Arthur, a sleeping hero who would one day awaken in the nation's greatest hour of need, ready to lead his war wagons once more from the depths of Blanik Mountain. This was more than simple hero worship. It was the collective memory of a people weaving their greatest champion into the very fabric of the land, making him a permanent guardian of their spirit. The Taborite movement as a whole underwent a similar romanticization. The complex, often harsh realities of their millenarian faith and radical communism were sanded down and polished into a simpler, more potent symbol, the unyielding fight for freedom. Their war cry and their golden chalice became enduring emblems of Czech identity and resistance against overwhelming oppression. In the 19th century, as a new wave of national revival swept across Bohemia, artists, writers, and composers eagerly reached back for these symbols. The Taborites were resurrected in grand operas and epic poetry, no longer portrayed as dangerous heretics, but as noble ancestors who fought for the soul of the nation. Their struggle was reframed as a precursor to the modern quest for an independent Czech state, a sacred chapter in a long story of defiance against German and Austrian domination. Why did this particular history resonate so deeply? because it proved that the small could stand against the mighty, that faith and ingenuity could humble empires. The war wagon was not just a clever tactic, it was a metaphor for the resilient Czech spirit, a mobile fortress of cultural identity that could never be truly conquered. The songs that once terrified imperial knights were now sung as national anthems, their lyrics a reminder that the price of freedom was always paid in advance by those willing to dream of a new Jerusalem. This transformation from excommunicated heretics to national treasures reveals a profound truth about history. The past is not a fixed record, but a story that is constantly being retold, its characters reshaped to meet the needs of the present. The legendary Taborites, forever etched into the heart of Czech folklore, became more than just men. They became an everlasting ideal. But what does the earth itself remember of their defiant dream? The stones of Tabor hold secrets that written histories have long forgotten, and modern archaeology has begun to listen. Excavations within the old town have peeled back the layers of time, revealing the physical blueprint of that radical commune. The circular street plan, once just a theory on old maps, has been confirmed, a tangible echo of their ideology of unity and collective defense. Beneath the quaint cobblestones of today's peaceful square, archaeologists have found the remnants of the original common treasury, the very chest where believers cast their worldly wealth to be shared by all. This was not a mythical story, it was a real, functioning institution at the heart of their city. The cellars, those deep, cool spaces carved from the rock beneath the houses, tell a story of a community always prepared for siege. They are not mere storage rooms, but extensive labyrinths, large enough to shelter the entire population and preserve the food supplies that kept the revolution alive through long winters and imperial blockades. The artifacts pulled from this soil are strikingly ordinary, and that is what makes them so profound. We find the simple pottery and cookware of daily life, but with a notable absence of luxury items. There are few imported goods, few decorative trinkets. The material culture unearthed in the earliest layers is one of stark utility, a physical testament to their commitment to apostolic poverty. These people were not just preaching simplicity, they were living it, their belongings reflecting a society that valued communal survival over personal adornment. Yet among these humble items, other discoveries speak of their unique identity. Molds for casting communion chalices from pewter have been found, evidence of their mass production of the very symbol that defined their heresy. Every believer, not just the priest, would have drunk from a cup made here, in the heart of their fortress. Even more telling are the remnants of their revolutionary industry. Slag and fragments of armor plating point to the busy forges where common blacksmiths, brothers in faith, hammered out the plates for their brigandines and the parts for their war wagons. The economy of Tabor was a war economy, geared entirely toward sustaining their fight for the soul of the world. The very dirt they walked on confirms that their radical vision was not an abstract philosophy, but a reality built with their own hands, a society forged in poverty, unity, and an unyielding readiness for a war they believed was ordained by heaven itself. Their war against the material world runs far deeper than politics or even mainstream reform. If we peel back the layers of their rebellion, a startling possibility emerges that the Taborites were, in essence, Gnostic warriors. Their entire crusade can be interpreted not as a fight for a better church, but as a revolt against the church itself as the chief creation of a false material god. In the classic Gnostic worldview, the physical universe is a prison, a flawed creation crafted by a lesser, ignorant deity known as the demiurge. This false god creates illusions to keep human souls trapped in matter, blind to their true spiritual origin in a higher, unknowable divine realm. The established church, with its obsession with physical relics, ornate cathedrals, and the absolute authority of a human pope, perfectly fit the role of the demiurge's earthly institution. It was a vast, gilded cage for the spirit. The Taborites' violent iconoclasm takes on a new, profound meaning through this lens. They were not merely destroying distractions, they were systematically dismantling the illusions of the false god. Every statue they smashed was a prison bar broken. Every stained glass window shattered was a veil torn away, allowing a glimpse of the true, formless divine light beyond the demiurge's colorful deception. Their whitewashed churches, stripped bare of imagery, were not just austere. They were attempts to create a vacuum, a blank space where the soul could encounter the true God directly, without the false intermediaries of the material world. This pursuit of direct knowledge or gnosis was the ultimate goal. They rejected the need for a priestly class because true enlightenment could not be granted by another human, nor could it be found in rote rituals. It had to be awakened within through a personal, revolutionary encounter with the divine spirit. Their belief in the priesthood of all believers was a declaration that every person carried the divine spark, the hidden knowledge of the true God, and that this inner gnosis was the only valid authority. Think of their most radical social experiment, the abolition of private property. In a Gnostic reading, this was not just an economic policy, it was a radical renunciation of the material world itself, a collective shedding of the possessions and hierarchies that the false god used to chain souls to his creation. By throwing their wealth into a common chest, they were symbolically rejecting the very currency of the demiurge's realm. Their apocalyptic fervor, the belief that the world was about to end, aligns perfectly with the Gnostic hope for the final dissolution of the material cosmos, the ultimate escape from the prison of flesh and matter. Their war was not to reform the world, but to end it, to shatter the demiurge's creation and liberate the spirit for its return to the true, alien God. This hidden thread of Gnostic revolt weaves their most extreme actions into a coherent, terrifying whole, revealing a spiritual war waged not for the soul of the Church, but against the very nature of the world it ruled. Jan Hus was more than a historical figure to the Taborites. He was a ghost in their council chambers and a fire in their sermons. His execution did not silence him. It amplified his voice, transforming the man into a timeless symbol of defiance against a corrupt world. They did not merely remember him, they communed with him, seeing his spirit as a living participant in their holy war. His writings, particularly his letters from prison, were not just studied, they were treated as sacred texts, blueprints for their radical reformation. In these documents, they found not a call for compromise, but a justification for their most extreme actions. When Hus wrote that a Christian should obey God rather than man, the Taborites took this as a divine mandate to reject all earthly authority, from the emperor to the pope. His critique of the church's wealth became their rationale for abolishing private property. His insistence on Scripture as the sole authority became their weapon to dismantle 7 centuries of church tradition. Every sermon preached in Tabor was framed as an extension of Hus' final, unyielding stand at the Council of Constance. The preachers would invoke his name as they stood before their congregations, declaring that they were finishing the work he had begun, that the chalice for which he died would now be defended with flail and cannon. His martyrdom was their foundational myth, a story told and retold to harden their resolve. Can you feel the weight of that legacy? To be a Taborite was to live every day under the shadow of that pyre, to feel the heat of its flames as a constant reminder of the stakes. They were not just fighting for an idea, they were avenging a saint and building the kingdom he had been killed for envisioning. This spiritual presence turned their rebellion into a sacred duty, a debt owed to a prophet whose death demanded a revolution. That same defiant spirit, the one that sought to build heaven on a Bohemian hilltop, never truly vanished from the world. It merely changed its clothes, reappearing in modern movements that challenge established power and seek a more direct personal connection with the divine. The Taborites' core ideals of anti-establishment spirituality, for instance, resonate powerfully in the New Age and modern pagan movements. Just as the Taborites rejected the Vatican's authority in favor of a priesthood of all believers, many today are leaving traditional churches to craft their own spiritual paths, blending ancient wisdom with personal intuition. They seek God or the goddess or the universe, not in a distant cathedral, but within themselves and in nature, echoing the Taborite insistence that the divine needs no human intermediary. This is not a rejection of faith, but a rebellion against the middleman, a search for raw, unmediated spiritual experience that would have felt very familiar to the radicals of Tabor. We see their legacy even more clearly in the global rise of intentional communities and eco-villages. These modern experiments are secular heirs to the Taborite social dream. People are voluntarily pooling their resources, sharing land and labor, and attempting to create self-sufficient societies based on ecological and ethical principles rather than pure profit. While they may not cite biblical prophecy, their goal is strikingly similar: to build a small, purified haven in opposition to a mainstream culture they see as corrupt and unsustainable. They are building their own tabors, not with war wagons, but with permaculture gardens and renewable energy, proving the enduring human urge to start over from scratch. Perhaps the most profound theological echo is found in liberation theology, a powerful movement that emerged within the Catholic Church in Latin America during the 20th century. Its central tenet is that God has a preferential option for the poor, and that working for social and economic justice is a fundamental Christian duty. This mirrors the Taborites' fusion of spiritual fervor with a radical call for social equality. Both movements read the Bible and saw not a call for passive piety, but a revolutionary manifesto demanding the overthrow of oppressive systems. A liberation theology priest standing with impoverished farmers against a wealthy, oppressive landowner is a direct descendant of a Taborite preacher urging peasants to see their feudal lord as a servant of the Antichrist. The methods are different: nonviolent resistance versus armed revolt, but the foundational belief is the same: that faith without action to liberate the oppressed is a dead faith. Why does this pattern repeat across centuries? It speaks to a timeless, deeply human yearning. The desire to build a utopia based on divine principles, to create a kingdom of justice and equality here on earth, is a powerful and perennial force. It is the dream of a world where the sacred and the social are one, where how you treat your neighbor is the truest measure of your faith. The Taborites were one dramatic, early eruption of this dream, a testament to its incredible power to inspire and its terrifying potential for conflict. Their story reminds us that the quest for a new Jerusalem is never truly over. It simply finds new hills to build upon and new generations to hear its call. Their story is a testament to the terrifying power of an idea. From a hilltop fortress, a band of radical believers looked at the entire medieval world and declared it obsolete. They waged war not for a king, but for a kingdom of heaven they were certain was at hand, fusing a raw, esoteric faith with a revolutionary social vision. Yet the world they sought to burn down ultimately proved too strong, its armies and its compromises crushing their military might and dissolving their dream of a new Jerusalem. But to see them as mere failures is to miss their profound and haunting legacy. The Taborites stand as one of history's most potent examples of how a deeply held, unconventional spirituality can ignite a firestorm of radical political and social action. Their belief that they were building a divine kingdom justified the overthrow of every earthly hierarchy, proving that when people feel they are acting with cosmic purpose, they become an unstoppable and often terrifying force. Their war wagons are dust, their common treasury is long empty, and the fields of Lipany are silent, yet the questions they raised echo through the centuries. What happens when faith demands not just personal piety, but the total transformation of society? How far are we willing to go for a vision of a more perfect world? The fire they lit was never fully extinguished. It smolders in every movement that challenges entrenched power in the name of a higher truth, so we are left with one final, lingering thought. Are the seeds of Tabor, that volatile mixture of mystic hope and revolutionary fervor, simply lying dormant in the soil of human history, waiting for the right conditions to sprout once more.